The year 1914 witnessed the eruption of a conflict so devastating that it would forever be known as the Great War. It was a cataclysm that shattered the fragile peace of Europe. For 4 long years, from 1914 to 1918, the nations of the world were locked in a struggle of unprecedented brutality and destruction. The Central Powers, led by Germany and Austria-Hungary, faced off against the Allied powers, spearheaded by Britain, France, and Russia. Millions of soldiers and civilians would perish in the maelstrom. The world would never be the same. This global conflict, later known as World War I, left an indelible mark on human history. The war's origins were complex and multifaceted, rooted in a web of alliances, imperial ambitions, and fervent nationalism. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, provided the spark that ignited this powder keg. To understand the outbreak of World War I, one must delve into the intricate network of alliances that entangled the nations of Europe. These alliances were not just simple agreements but complex webs of mutual defense pacts and secret treaties that bound countries together in a precarious balance of power. The Triple Alliance, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, stood in opposition to the Triple Entente, comprising France, Russia, and Great Britain. These alliances were meant to create a sense of security, but they also meant that any conflict involving one country could quickly involve others, turning a small dispute into a large-scale war. These alliances, designed to deter aggression, ironically served to escalate tensions. Diplomatic efforts were often overshadowed by the fear that any compromise might be seen as a sign of weakness, leading to a more aggressive stance from potential adversaries. Adding fuel to the fire was the rampant militarism that gripped Europe in the early 20th century. Nations glorified military power and celebrated their armed forces, fostering a culture where war was seen as a legitimate means of resolving disputes. Military spending soared as nations engaged in a dangerous arms race. Factories churned out weapons at an unprecedented rate, and new technologies promised even more devastating capabilities. Germany in particular sought to expand its naval power, challenging Britain's dominance at sea. This naval arms race created further friction, as Britain felt its own security was being threatened by Germany's ambitions. This military buildup created an atmosphere of suspicion and heightened the risk of conflict. Each nation watched the others with a wary eye, ready to mobilize at the slightest provocation. Imperialism, the pursuit of colonial empires, also played a significant role in the road to war. European powers were not only competing on the continent, but also around the globe, seeking to expand their influence and control over vast territories. European powers competed fiercely for control of territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. These colonial ambitions often led to conflicts in far-flung regions, which in turn strained relations back in Europe. These imperial rivalries fueled tensions and created a climate of mistrust among the great powers. Propaganda often depicted rival nations as threats to national security and honor, further inflaming public sentiment. Nationalism, the fervent belief in the superiority of one's nation, surged through Europe in the years leading up to the war. This intense national pride often translated into a disdain for other nations, and a readiness to go to war to defend national honor. This intense patriotism, often tinged with ethnic and cultural prejudices, exacerbated existing tensions and created an environment ripe for conflict. Nationalist movements within multi-ethnic empires also sought independence, adding another layer of complexity to the already volatile situation. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne by a Serbian nationalist, would prove to be the catalyst for the outbreak of war. This single event set off a chain reaction of ultimatums, mobilizations, and declarations of war, plunging Europe into one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie on June 28, 1914, sent shockwaves through Europe. This tragic event marked a pivotal moment in history, setting off a chain reaction that would lead to one of the deadliest conflicts the world had ever seen. The Archduke, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had been visiting Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, when he was shot dead by Gavrilo Princip, a young Serbian nationalist. Princip was a member of the Black Hand, a secret society committed to ending Austro-Hungarian rule in the Balkans. The assassination was a culmination of simmering tensions between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. These tensions had been building for years, fueled by nationalist movements and territorial disputes in the volatile Balkan region. Austria-Hungary, determined to crush Serbian nationalism, saw the assassination as an opportunity to assert its dominance. The empire's leaders believed that a swift and decisive response would deter further nationalist uprisings and solidify their control over the region. Germany, bound by its alliance to Austria-Hungary, issued a blank check of support, emboldening Vienna to take a hard line against Serbia. This unconditional backing from Germany gave Austria-Hungary the confidence to pursue a more aggressive stance. On July 23, 1914, Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding satisfaction for the assassination. The ultimatum contained a series of harsh demands, which were designed to be nearly impossible for Serbia to accept in full. Serbia's response, while conciliatory on most points, failed to appease Austria-Hungary, which declared war on July 28, 1914. The declaration of war set off a rapid escalation of hostilities, drawing in other nations due to a complex web of alliances. The system of alliances swiftly came into play. These alliances, meant to provide security, instead created a domino effect, pulling multiple countries into the conflict. Russia, bound by treaty to protect Serbia, mobilized its troops. This mobilization was seen as a direct threat by Austria-Hungary and its ally, Germany. Germany, fearing a two-front war, declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914. The German military strategy, known as the Schlieffen Plan, aimed to quickly defeat France before turning east to face Russia. France, allied with Russia, mobilized its forces, prompting Germany to declare war on France on August 3, 1914. The conflict was rapidly expanding, engulfing more of Europe. Great Britain, obligated to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914, after German troops crossed into Belgium. The invasion of Belgium was a crucial factor in Britain's decision to enter the war. The Great War had begun. What started as a regional conflict in the Balkans had now escalated into a full-scale global war, involving the world's major powers and setting the stage for unprecedented levels of destruction and loss. Section 4. A Continent at War. The Opening Salvos. The early months of the war witnessed a flurry of military activity as both sides sought a swift and decisive victory. Germany, adhering to the Schlieffen Plan, launched a lightning offensive through neutral Belgium, aiming to knock France out of the war before Russia could fully mobilize. The German advance was initially successful, pushing deep into France and coming within miles of Paris. However, the German offensive stalled at the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914. French and British troops, bolstered by reinforcements rushed from Paris in taxicabs, launched a fierce counterattack, halting the German advance and ending any hopes of a quick victory in the West. The war on the Western Front settled into a bloody stalemate. In the East, the war was characterized by greater fluidity. Russia, despite its vast size and manpower, suffered from poor infrastructure and inadequate leadership. The Germans, led by the brilliant strategist Paul von Hindenburg, inflicted crushing defeats on the Russians at the battles of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes in August and September 1914. These victories effectively knocked Russia out of the war in the East. Section 5. Trenches of Despair. The Western Front. With the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, the war on the Western Front devolved into a brutal war of attrition. The initial hopes for a quick victory were dashed as both sides realized that they were in for a prolonged and grueling conflict. The Western Front became a static battlefield, where movement was limited, and the front lines barely shifted over the years. Both sides dug in, constructing elaborate trench systems that stretched for hundreds of miles across France and Belgium. These trenches were not just simple ditches, they were complex networks with multiple lines of defense, communication trenches, and support systems. The soldiers lived, fought, and died in these trenches, which became their homes for the duration of the war. The trenches, often infested with rats, lice, and disease, became symbols of the war's horrors. The living conditions were appalling, with soldiers facing constant dampness, mud, and the stench of decay. The presence of vermin and the spread of diseases like trench foot and dysentery added to the misery of trench life. Life in the trenches was a living hell. Soldiers had to endure not only the physical hardships, but also the psychological strain of constant danger and the loss of comrades. The relentless noise of artillery bombardments and the fear of sudden attacks took a heavy toll on their mental health. Soldiers endured constant shelling, machine gun fire, and the ever-present threat of sniper attacks. The front lines were a deadly place where any movement could draw enemy fire. The soldiers had to remain vigilant at all times, knowing that death could come from above or from a hidden sniper's bullet. The battles that raged between the trenches were some of the bloodiest in human history. The no-man's land between the opposing trenches was a killing ground, where countless soldiers lost their lives in futile attempts to gain ground. The scale of the carnage was unprecedented, with entire battalions being wiped out in a matter of hours. The Battle of the Somme, which began on July 1, 1916, epitomized the futility of trench warfare. It was one of the largest battles of the war, involving millions of men and resulting in staggering casualties. The initial artillery bombardment was supposed to destroy the German defenses, but it failed to achieve its objectives. The British Army, attacking after a massive artillery bombardment, suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone. The scale of the losses was shocking, and the battle dragged on for months, with little to show for the enormous sacrifice. The Somme became a symbol of the senseless slaughter and the high human cost of the war. By the time the battle ended in November 1916, both sides had suffered over 1 million casualties. The human cost was staggering, and the front lines remained largely unchanged. The battle demonstrated the limitations of trench warfare and the difficulty of achieving a decisive breakthrough. The introduction of new technologies, such as poison gas, machine guns, and tanks, only added to the carnage. These innovations were intended to break the deadlock, but they often resulted in even greater destruction and loss of life. The war became a testing ground for new weapons, each more deadly than the last. Poison gas, first used by the Germans in 1915, proved to be a terrifying weapon, inflicting horrific injuries and instilling terror in the hearts of soldiers. The use of gas masks became essential, but they were not always effective, and the fear of gas attacks added to the psychological burden of the soldiers. Machine guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute turned battlefields into killing fields. The defensive power of machine guns made frontal assaults incredibly costly, and the attackers often faced devastating losses before even reaching the enemy lines. Tanks, first deployed by the British in 1916, offered a glimmer of hope for breaking the stalemate, but their early models were slow, unreliable, and vulnerable to attack. Despite their limitations, tanks represented a new era of warfare, and their development would continue to shape future conflicts.